Welcome to the SAIS Women Lead Practicum presentation, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Dr. Chiedo Nwankwor. I direct the SAIS Women Lead, which is a leadership training platform with the goal of equipping tomorrow's leaders, especially women, with the skills and confidence they need to effectively solve issues of global importance. As you know, there is clear evidence that women's advancement creates a healthier, more prosperous, and stable world. Increasing women's roles in leadership improve all the indicators of growth and stability. Going by current events, as women leaders across the world display exemplary leadership in minimizing deaths from the COVID-19 pandemic and providing effective and compassionate leadership for their citizens, it appears that living in a country led by a woman increases an individual's chance of surviving a global health crisis. And not to conceptually stretch, but given that leadership is a key factor here, and that leadership skills transfer across issue areas, one can arguably project that living in a country led by a woman increases an individual's odds of survival on the whole. Yet the gender gap persists in all spheres. This is particularly significant in arenas of leadership and policymaking in both domestic and international affairs. Currently, women hold only 7% of the world's government roles. Perhaps one silver lining in this tragic crisis, if there was ever one, might be the introduction of a paradigm shift in leadership frameworks, which before now has privileged masculinity and normalized male leadership. The mission of the SAIS Women Lead, therefore, is to contribute to reducing the gender gap across all sectors through leadership and policy, using a combination of curricular and co-curricular activities, which include research and relevant coursework across the various programs in SAIS, skills development through conferences, seminars, workshops, and the Practicum. The Practicum is a core aspect of the program, and it links scholarship and experiential learning. The SAIS Women Lead Practicum partners students with public, private, and civil society organizations to work on development issues that advance women's status and improve the welfare of communities across the world. This year's Practicum features 3 projects. The first is a project in partnership with WAREC, one of the bigger NGOs working to eliminate gender-based violence in Nepal. The project maps community approaches to reducing gender-based violence in Kathmandu, Nepal. The second project is in partnership with the University of the Philippines, Cebu, and it assesses women's roles in disaster risk reduction in Cebu, Philippines. Last but not least, is a project in partnership with the International Republican Institute, IRI, on increasing women's political participation in Ethiopia. We are grateful to all our partners, allies, and collaborators who have worked alongside us this year and in years past, whose support has ensured the success of this program. WAREC, University of the Philippines, Cebu, the International Republican Institute, the Assistant Dean for Academic Affairs, Julie Misek, the Associate Dean of Development and Alumni Affairs, William Roth, Assistant Professor Narges Bajoghli, Professors Mvemba Dizolili and Roman Raoul, Marshall Millsap, Kathy Pike, Sarah O'Hagan, Sarah O'Rourke, Carmen Surabidi, and many others too numerous to mention here. All crises are gendered, although there is a tendency in policy-making circles to bury one's head in the sand and pretend otherwise. One of the clearer points of reflection in the ongoing pandemic discourse is a consensus on its deeply gendered nature, and that the depths and scope of its gendered impacts are yet to be fully known. If nothing else, the COVID-19 global health crisis highlights the need to increase support for gendered research in international relations and women's leadership. We will continue to contribute to this agenda here in SAIS in general, and in the SAIS Women Lead program in particular. We welcome your partnership and hope other knowledge and power productive arenas will take this seriously as well. We congratulate this cohort of women leaders in waiting, whose professionalism, team skills, hard work, can-do attitude, and confidence make them assets to any employer. Finally, we're currently welcoming partners for the 2021 academic year practicum, and we'll be happy to chat with you. We're also interested in your ideas and welcome your contributions. You can donate funds and volunteer your skills and connections to new partnerships. You can reach us at Women Lead SAIS on Instagram, SAIS Lead on Twitter, or email us at saiswomenlead@jhu.edu. Next, we're delighted to share with you a very special message from Dean Eliot Cohen. This message will be followed by our keynote, then presentations by the Practicum teams, and reflections from Professor Narges Bajoghli. We will end the day with a Q&A session. Please feel free to submit your questions ahead of time using the Q&A button. We will try to address as many questions as possible. Again, a very warm welcome to you. And now, the Dean of Johns Hopkins SAIS, Professor Eliot Cohen.
This is Dean Cohen. I want to welcome you to SAIS Women Lead. As I thought about this event, I thought about the women leaders who've made a tremendous difference in my own career, from Judith Shklar, the first female professor tenured in the government department at Harvard, to Condoleezza Rice, the Secretary of State, for whom I had the privilege of working. And that makes me particularly proud of SAIS Women Lead. For over 3 years, we've placed women in positions in organizations around the globe, public, private, and nonprofit, all with the aim of developing women leaders. Leadership is going to be an increasing focus in our curriculum, and this is going to be an essential part of it. We support the students who've been engaging in the research that you'll be hearing presented today. I want to thank the faculty and staff who've made it possible. And I just want to say that we are very proud indeed that we will be launching a large group of women who we believe are well prepared to use their talents for the common good, in part as a result of SAIS Women Lead. Thank you very much.
And now, the keynote from Megan O'Donnell.
Thank you.
Megan O'Donnell is the Assistant Director of Center for Global Development's Gender Program and a Senior Policy Analyst. She works on issues related to women's economic empowerment and financial inclusion, gender data and measurement, and development effectiveness. Prior to CGD, O'Donnell worked at the One Campaign, an international advocacy organization focused on sub-Saharan Africa, where she led the development of One's gender and inclusive growth-focused policy recommendations to donors and country governments. Before joining One, she coordinated CGD's gender research program and has also worked with the Inter-American Development Bank, the International Center for Research on Women, CARE USA, Bayan Global, and the Middle East Institute. She has a master's degree in Middle Eastern Studies from the University of Oxford and a bachelor's degree in politics and French from the University of Virginia. Please join me in welcoming Megan O'Donnell.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nwankwor, and thank you for allowing me to contribute to this exciting session. I'd like to add my congratulations to all of the students who will be presenting in a moment. But before we turn to the practicum presentations, I had been asked to say just a few words about the importance of women's leadership, and in particular, the SAIS Women Lead program in fostering and promoting it. Let me start by saying that in making this case for women's leadership, that I, and I'm sure many of us who work on issues of women's rights and gender equality, wish that we didn't have to continue making it, that we already lived in a global community that recognized the inherent value of leadership being inclusive, whether from the perspective of gender, race, ethnicity, geographic location, sexual orientation and identity, migrant status, and other demographic characteristics. But of course, because we don't yet live in that world, programs like SAIS Women Lead are all the more pivotal in getting us closer to making it a reality. And as Dr. Nwankwor alluded to, now more than ever, with the COVID-19 pandemic and global recession top of mind, we are seeing how critical women's leadership is to immediate crisis response, to providing basic social safety nets for people who are now even more economically vulnerable, and to putting us on a path to recovery from the pandemic. We see that women are disproportionately the frontline healthcare workers who are fighting this disease head on, make up about 70% of all frontline healthcare workers. We see that they're also concentrated in other essential professions like food production and distribution, like caregiving to children and to the elderly and the sick. And we also see, as was referenced, that among political leaders, it is women in top political positions that are getting a lot of recognition and credit for their dexterous management of this crisis. Whether we look at Angela Merkel or Jacinda Ardern or Tsai Ing-wen in country governments, or we look at donor and UN agencies and the leadership of Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala or Kristalina Georgieva. We see that women are handling this crisis in a way that is likely to put us on a better track. Now, of course, it's very important to note that this is not because women are naturally or biologically superior. As we've learned from history, there's real danger, right, in those types of arguments, even when they seem to elevate a particular group or put them on a pedestal of superiority. But rather, for those of us who do focus on gender as a social construct and gender inequality writ large understand, it is because of socialization that pushes certain ways of leading and cooperating onto women. Importantly, it is also because the countries, communities, businesses, and organizations that prioritize inclusive leadership tend to be better run. And so with that in mind, I'll just highlight a handful of qualities of good leadership that we are seeing emphasized through this crisis and more broadly, and where we see this program, SAIS Women Lead, seeking to embody and promote those types of qualities in its students, so that we hope one day these qualities will not be predominantly associated with one gender, but rather respected and emphasized for all leaders. The first, of course, centers on collaboration. The students who will be presenting have worked collaboratively to put together the presentations you'll see. And we see on the global stage that while under threat more than ever before, multilateralism is that much more essential in fighting this pandemic. We know that we are fighting a global disease that knows no borders. And so rather than taking a zero-sum country versus country approach, it's going to require global cooperation to really address all of the risks involved. The second is a focus on research and evidence. Again, the students here have spent a year of their lives digging deep into these projects that they'll present, and we see that that facts and evidence-based approach is all the more pivotal in fighting COVID-19. Across the world, we know that women and girls have faced particular barriers that have kept them from getting an education, having access to that research and evidence that has typically been afforded to men. But now, as times change, we see that there is an increased priority on girls getting education in many contexts where they are not yet able to equally inherit land or take over a family business. Families have recognized that for girls, the way ahead is to be educated. And so as women continue to rise in percentages among doctors and lawyers and other high-skilled professions, we see that those skills and that evidence-based approach is going to be all the more necessary to fighting global crises going forward. And the third is a focus on caregiving and care ethics. We see that women and girls worldwide, regardless of country context or income level, still bear the brunt of most unpaid care work globally. And while this work has been significantly undervalued, sometimes not valued at all, such as in GDP calculations, it is this work that we are now deeming essential in times of crisis. And so applying those sorts of care ethics to high-level political and other types of leadership, we recognize that the leaders who are doing the best really have a mandate and an understanding that they need to serve, not rule, associated with care ethics. And that when women and girls are those who face unique and disproportionate vulnerabilities, they not only need a seat at the table and to be listened to, but really need to have the decision-making power that allows them to represent the voices of those who've typically been excluded. We see that leadership results in better outcomes, whether in village councils in India or post-conflict peace negotiations, when women are at the table and do have decision-making power. So with that, I'm very excited to hand it back over to Dr. Nwankwor and to hear the presentations from this group of rising women leaders. I know that because of their collaborative efforts, their emphasis on research and evidence, they are well positioned to serve their communities and countries as strong and effective leaders going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Megan. And now to the presentations. The first presentation is on the project that seeks to increase women's political participation in Ethiopia, and it's in partnership with IRI. Here to present are Samantha Camilletti, Zarina Bentham, Stephanie Arstate, and Mabel Alamu.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you, Dr. Nwankwor, for that great introduction. Ethiopia made international headlines in 2018 when they joined a small group of countries that had achieved gender parity in the parliament. At the same time, around 20% of women were recorded to have voted in the last election in 2015. These are only two statistics, but they immediately introduce a puzzle. There is a new progressive wave within Ethiopia that seems to be increasing women's visibility as political leaders, which is great. However, is this same progress increasing women's political participation at the lower levels? Our research rests on the assumption that it's not, and we broadly found 3 tiers of barriers that continue to influence and suppress women's political participation, which, as you'll see from the slides, manifest at the societal, political, and individual levels. These barriers are all intersectional and interactive. In order to address them, it will take a collaborative effort from the government, civil society organizations, and political parties. And Mabel will highlight some of our recommendations at the end of this presentation. We spent 2 weeks in Addis Ababa and Jimma, a small semi-urban city to the south, talking to men and women about their experiences in the political sphere. Our slides show some examples from the survey questions we asked. We heard stories about people's experiences with past elections, opinions on where Ethiopia is heading under Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, personal stories about getting involved in community organizations, and a range of other similar topics. Part of our project was also about connecting these stories and trying to identify broader patterns. And Zarina will start by sharing the patterns we found at the societal level.
So the first societal barrier that we encountered were norms and attitudes. And this is where women are primarily seen as homemakers or caregivers responsible for their husbands and their children. And you can read an example of this in the quotes below, which is from one of our participants. The next societal barrier is language. And we found that language manifests itself as a barrier in 3 specific ways. The first is through old proverbs or traditional sayings that often liken women to children or animals without intelligence and with little leadership abilities. Now, while majority of the women we spoke to said that these proverbs would be rare to hear today, they do agree that there is a lasting legacy that continues to make women perceived as incompetent in leadership positions or even simply politically. The next way in which language is a barrier is through gendered language. Now, like many languages around the world, languages in Ethiopia have male versions and female versions of words. So words can be either masculine or feminine. We found that most correspondence about politics, either on the TV, radio, in the media, in newspapers, is usually presented in the masculine form of words. And what we realized was that this has an exclusionary effect on women because it reinforces the idea that politics is a man's game. The final way in which language is a societal barrier to women's political participation is because of the use of political jargon. Now, while it's true that men and women alike may not understand the political jargon that's pervasive in correspondence around politics in Ethiopia, it's more significant for women, first and foremost, because of an education gap that exists, making Ethiopian women less educated than men. On another note, even if women are educated, just as many of the women we spoke to did have some level of education, many of them reported that they hardly discuss politics with their friends or their family, which makes women less likely to understand political jargon. I will now hand it over to Stephanie, who will go through the political barriers that we found.
Thank you. While we found several political barriers that limited women's political participation in Ethiopia, I want to highlight two: fear and political violence, and lack of role models at the state and local level. First, let's talk about political violence. Political violence, unfortunately, has been a common occurrence in Ethiopia, especially after the trauma of the country's almost 20-year-long civil war. However, interviews with both women and men reveal that there is a steep gender divide to the extent to which fear constrains political participation. For example, 5 women mentioned a fear of violence as the main reason why they were disinterested in politics, compared to no men. Second, I want to touch on the lack of role models at the local and state level. A significant number of those interviewed, both women and men, discussed the positive impact that a recent increase in women in politics at the national level had had on them. Our data made it clear on the existence of an aspirational effect and show that its impacts are very important. For many women, seeing the number of women in government increase did create a positive impact, signaling that the government values of women's political participation, at least symbolically, are very instrumental. However, many pointed out that there were fewer or no women in politics at the local or state level that they could look up to, which discouraged them from seeing politics as attainable for them. And now I would like to hand it off to Sam, who will talk about the individual barriers that we found.
The barriers at the individual level fell into 3 larger categories: time constraints, education levels, and individual finances. Within time constraints, a majority of respondents said that they did not have time to engage in political activity because they are the primary caregivers responsible for household chores and looking after children. Over half of the respondents believed that this represented the biggest hardship for women to be involved politically. Another significant barrier was education. Education was broadly defined in 2 different ways: lack of civic education and lack of formal education. Some women reported that they did not understand politics and therefore found it difficult to get involved. Conversely, a participant mentioned that she and her family do not discuss politics at home because they are not formally educated or literate, which makes it difficult to access information about politics or how to get involved at the local levels. A majority of women responded that both formal and civic education should be expanded and prioritized by the government, implicitly drawing a link between education and political empowerment. Finally, there is the barrier of individual finances, which impacts women more acutely than men. Several women mentioned that not having enough income prevented them from participating, although rarely was there an elaboration on this explicit link, whether it was due to high transportation costs or the inability to leave work early to attend meetings or other factors similar to this. Another participant said that a woman's low income can breed dependence on their husband in some cases, and creates this complex power dynamic that limits their ability to freely choose what they get involved in. These types of stories are important to highlight because political interest is as much a barrier as personal preference is not, especially as these factors are not necessarily always influenced by complex and deeply rooted gender norms. And now I turn it over to Mabel to talk about our recommendations.
We target our recommendations to the government of Ethiopia, political parties, and our client IRI. As discovered in our research, many of the public announcements and legal documents are presented with the masculine nouns and pronouns. So we recommend that IRI, in partnership with other CSOs, organize a country-wide language campaign that changes the masculine pronouns and nouns to the feminine form to empower women. The second recommendation addresses the lack of widespread civic education. Currently, CSOs have to receive accreditation from the National Electoral Board to implement civic and voter education programs. This process is often cumbersome and it often limits the ability of some organizations to disseminate information about voters and citizens' rights. So we recommend that the process is streamlined to open the space for CSOs to further engage in these activities. Lastly, we call on political parties in Ethiopia to change their internal structure and increase women's participation within the parties. The responses we got revealed that the lack of role models within party politics was discouraging for women, and it often contributed to their disinterest in politics. For this reason, we asked political parties to self-reflect on the impact that they have on perpetuating gender norms through their actions and through their structure. Our research provides some clarity on the issues that continue to impact women and their ability to participate within Ethiopia. And it also provides crucial information to both domestic and international actors for developing strategies to advance women's status as equal citizens, and ultimately to contribute to a more inclusive democracy in Ethiopia. We would like to thank our partners at IRI and our fixer in Ethiopia for their help, input, and their advice, as it was invaluable to us in the shaping of this report. We would also like to thank Dr. Chiedo Nwankwor for a valuable contribution and a consistent support throughout each phase of the project. Advancing gender equality is very important to both SAIS and IRI, and we are honored to have had the opportunity to work together towards advancing women's participation in Ethiopia. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. The second presentation is on the project that seeks to, the second presentation is in partnership with Warwick on mapping community approach to gender-based violence reduction in Nepal. Here are Leah Danville, Emily Inge, Yi Yuan-Kui, and Emily Koenig.
Thank you, Professor Nwankwor. As nations shut down to alleviate coronavirus infections, women around the world are experiencing other life-threatening situations at home, gender-based violence. In the United States alone, reports of gender-based violence have increased by 35% since government-mandated quarantines. Yet, the reality in Nepal is even more bleak. Nearly half of Nepali women reported suffering 2 or more types of sexual coercion in their lifetime, and reports of violence have increased since COVID-19. Over the past year, our team has had the privilege to work alongside the Women's Rehabilitation Center, or WARC, based in Nepal, to identify the root causes of this problem and use media to increase WARC's ability to bring the staggering statistic to a halt. For 2 weeks in January, we traveled to Nepal to implement a 2-pronged strategic response. We sought to better understand the root causes of gender-based violence, as well as successful methods to provide support for survivors. Our research methodology included meetings and interviews with survivors and recipients of work services, informational meetings with related nonprofits, and monitoring and evaluating WARC's current programming. In addition, we researched Nepal's media landscape to establish effective messaging for a broader domestic and international audience. Prior to our field research, the literature narrowly defined gender-based violence as the physical harm a woman may experience in a relationship. We perceived the problem was due to substance abuse by violent partners in the ingrained patriarchal system. Our field findings, however, demonstrated that child marriage and dowry are leading causes to violence, but not necessarily partner substance abuse. We found that in Nepal, gender-based violence is broader than just physical harm and includes a lack of property and citizenship rights. Among the solutions, education has proven to afford women more power and agency. So, using our research findings, we have created programming and media recommendations to educate both local and international audiences. My colleague Emily Inge will now expound on our observations of WORK's programming and ways in which we believe the organization can better help women transform, reclaim, advocate, and empower themselves and others to transition from survivors to change makers.
Thank you. As Leah mentioned, our project with WORK had two goals: to improve capacity of existing programs and to extend WORK services through new media channels. I will now focus on the 4 programming recommendations, starting with intergenerational engagement. The dowry system and hierarchies in Nepali society were commonly mentioned as barriers for achieving gender equality and have negative impacts on young women and girls. We recommend that WORK expand their workshop to target different family relationships so they can effectively share information with all ages and sexes and halt patterns of generational violence. Next, mobile workshop review and new content. At the mobile workshop in Udaipur, we observed that men and women openly discussed gender norms of Nepali society, but throughout the workshop, men and women sat separately and women were noticeably more reserved during exercises about financial decision-making. We suggest that WORK review their content and apply experiential learning techniques to give equal chances for men and women to engage on topics that fall outside their expected gender roles. Additionally, our team observed that providing homework activities encouraged participants to attend multiple workshops and brought lessons outside the classroom. We recommend that WORK establish a reward framework to incentivize attendance and build out a mentor network made up of former participants so they become leaders in their own communities. Lastly, although WORK is an established women's organization in Nepal, the mobile workshop lacked visuals and overall did not showcase WORK as an organization. We recommend that WORK put together a base kit of materials for the workshop to better inform communities of their service offerings and cohesively promote their mission across districts. Now I will turn it over to Iwan to share our results from the media survey we administered while in Nepal.
Thank you. Our media survey had designed to focus not only on the usage, but also the ownership of different media. Given that most households own a radio, a television, a smart or a mobile phone, we presume that this media might be in greater use over the others. Therefore, our recommendations will focus on both offline workshop programming and online social media campaign. Next, we also try to figure out the correlation between gender and social media usage. Almost all results show that Facebook is the most popular application for all gender groups. However, men and women use Facebook in different ways, as most women are not aware of the proper use of Facebook. Meanwhile, women from multiple focus groups commented that their use of the household mobile phone are less than the men in the family, and their primary use of the smartphone are for communication with their friends and family. So we also suggest to print out our media products and hand out to villagers. Next, I will pass on to Emily to talk about the media recommendations in detail.
Thanks, Iwan. So for our research, it was important to evaluate both the causes of gender-based violence and media consumption patterns in Nepal. The media component of our research allows us to help WORK better disseminate their services throughout Nepal, helping to reduce gender-based violence. Based on the survey data previously discussed, we had 4 media recommendations for work to help them better expand their service recipient network throughout Nepal. First, we suggested that they reorganize their website as it was difficult to navigate. We suggested they reorganize around the themes transform, reclaim, advocate, and empower, and help them identify which services they provide would be associated with each theme. Work has already begun reorganizing their website. Our second recommendation was that we suggested work take advantage of the rise of the availability of smartphones and the popularity of local radio and create a podcast series. This would help work change behaviors and attitudes while being at the forefront of a new media trend in Nepal. Our third recommendation was that work currently provides a variety of skills trainings, including DACA, which is a type of weaving. Through these trainings, women make different products, like the shoes you see below. And our idea is to take the products that women are already making in the skills trainings, brand them with the work logo, and sell them in local cafes and shops, particularly ones that cater to the international population in Kathmandu. This will allow work to create a small profit from the products and simultaneously spread their message to local and international populations. The last recommendation and part of our project was to create various infographics that you see below and a video that work could utilize on social media. The goal of our infographics was to focus on work's chosen narrative of survivors to change makers by highlighting the compelling stories of some of the gender-based violence survivors we interviewed during our field research. The video focuses on the themes transform, reclaim, advocate, and empower to highlight the services that work provides. We hope that these media materials will not only help work reach more women, but inspire people to become involved in the fight for women's rights. Gender-based violence is something that affects 1 in 3 women globally, and work has been working on the front lines to assist victims and prevent future abuses in Nepal for nearly 3 decades. This report hopes to bolster work's preventative programming and provide strategic media plans to help work spread their message and services throughout Nepal. Together, through programming and media, work can continue to transform survivors into change makers and eradicate gender-based violence from Nepal. Thank you for coming to our presentation, and thank you to everyone that has supported us throughout this project. We welcome you to ask further questions about our research in the Q&A at the end of the presentations. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The last project is in partnership with the University of the Philippines, Cebu, and it assesses the impacts of gender on communities' experience of disaster risk and management. Here are Miranda Bain, Zizu, and Alisa Pavia.
Thank you, Professor. In the Philippines and around the world, when disaster strikes, more women die than men. This is the most extreme of many ways that women are more impacted by disaster than men. Based on research our team conducted in Cebu City in the Philippines, our project tries to understand how disaster risk reduction strategies can factor in women's needs. We focused our study on local homeowners associations, which are mostly led by women, to understand the impact of women's leadership on these disaster experiences. So, how does gender really influence disaster outcomes? There are explicitly gendered issues that make women vulnerable, such as gender-based violence or maternal health. But to understand how women are disproportionately affected by disaster, we also need to consider how women more broadly participate in society, their financial stability, their access to basic resources, their housing. For example, women in the urban poor communities that were part of our study were more vulnerable than women with more financial resources and stable housing. Women experience disaster first, as women in our study communities were more often at home. The photo on the slide shows the aftermath of a fire that happened the week before we visited this community. Home in the communities we studied is often not a safe place, and it is women who are more likely to be there. The Philippines is very highly ranked, ranking 8th in the Global Gender Gap Index, but women still face many specific problems, especially in urban poor communities. The Philippines is also the 3rd highest in exposure to disaster risk in the entire world. Although the government has a national disaster response plan that mentions a gender responsive approach, it really fails to go into any detail on how to achieve that goal. And as we can see on the slide, women and children are 14 times more likely to die in a disaster than men, and approximately 50% of the women in disaster did not receive any relief goods when this disaster struck. Women are victims of disaster, but they are also leaders in disaster response. There is widespread acknowledgement from academia and international organizations that women play a leading role in organized community responses to disaster. However, these roles go largely unrecognized and unsupported because of deeply held gender norms and cultural beliefs. Community-based women's leadership is important to their communities because they are often the first to respond to disaster. They also have local networks that government bodies often lack. And in the Philippines specifically, homeowners associations are small, community-based organizations. Members elect officials who oversee local management of their communities and try to address concerns their members raise. When disaster strikes, these local groups are part of the community-level disaster response. These homeowners associations are also often led by women. Now Z will go into detail on our research.
Our research focuses on how women are impacted by disasters and on women as leaders in disaster response. We found that homeowner associations are useful community-based organizations to examine these two dynamics. Based on our preliminary research, we developed 2 main research questions. First, how do urban poor communities in Cebu, Philippines perceive the gendered risks of disaster? And based on this perception, if women's leadership makes an impact on the community's experience of disaster? If so, in what way? Specifically, we developed 3 different methods to conduct our research in the samples of 5 different homeowner associations. We wanted to study homeowners associations that were led by women and by men. However, while looking for which associations to study, we struggled to find those with majority men leaders. We also encountered difficulties in accessing some communities that were experiencing flood at that time. To know in-depth information about the leaders' perspectives, we had one-on-one interviews with the homeowners association's leaders, NGOs, and local government officials. We conducted surveys with the selected study communities. We went door to door to collect basic statistics about the members of the homeowner association. In this way, we collected 51 different responses on the association's members' perceptions on gender and disasters. We held focus group discussions that were either women only or men only. We researched if the gender of the leaders had an impact on the community's experiences of disaster. These discussions were interesting and useful because both the conversations and body language reflected a dynamic about the community's leadership. We used both quantitative and qualitative methods to analyze our data and summarized our findings in the next slide.
Through our research, we found that communities view women as more vulnerable than men to disaster in several distinct ways, in terms of hygiene, privacy and safety, and because women take on most of the responsibility for childcare. From our surveys and interviews, we also found that communities often don't value women's needs. Although they acknowledge that these exist, there is not much of a perception that these must be prioritized. We also found that women in urban poor communities are particularly vulnerable to disaster because they are often more housebound than men, even if they're working. Being at home in urban poor and often informal settlements adds risks. Although the communities do not always perceive these risks as gendered, they may nonetheless impact women more during disaster. We also found that there is a disconnect between the perception of women's roles in their communities and how they actually participate. For example, women who work for their communities and receive income are still perceived as unemployed, sometimes even by women themselves. This misalignment reflects that women are often undervalued by other community members, which risks affecting their ability to respond to disaster. Within the context of grassroots leadership, we found that women, more than men, can be better suited to help their communities when disaster strikes. Because women are often more present in their communities, they're in a position to have a deeper understanding of how to prioritize certain needs. In fact, women leaders appear to care more about uplifting the conditions of the community after disaster. The implication is that women are leaders in their communities and not just victims. However, women leaders face several challenges specifically because of their gender. Unfortunately, we found that women still struggle with deeply held gender norms pertaining to their role in society. We also found that most government officials are men. This impacts the ability of female leaders to help their communities, as these government officials often hold biases of their own. Although women are disproportionately affected by disaster and die more than men do, they're also resilient leaders. They are proud mothers, they are workers, and they are providers. If given the possibilities, they can have an influential role in Filipino society to help uplift the conditions that women face. Based on our research, we came up with several recommendations for the University of Philippines, Cebu. We think that the University of the Philippines can work together with civil society organizations to create trainings for local communities with a specific gender focus. The University of the Philippines should work directly with homeowners associations to help develop a gender disaster plan. And lastly, the University of the Philippines can develop a list of goods that incorporates women's sanitary and hygiene needs for disaster relief kit and initiate a campaign to advocate for the basic needs for all among government officials. Thank you for listening to our presentation. We would like to extend our deepest appreciation to both SAIS and the University of the Philippines, Cebu, for giving us this incredible opportunity to study women empowerment in Cebu. We'd like to extend our thanks specifically to Professor Chiedo Nwankwor, Dr. Wina Hira, and Professor Kairal Buro-Cañete as our supervisors, as well as Mimosa Sang and Adam Patajo as our research assistants from the University of the Philippines, Cebu.
Thank you so very much. And now to offer her reflections, here is one of the faculty supervisors for the Practicum, Assistant Professor of Middle Eastern Studies, an award-winning anthropologist, filmmaker and writer, and author of the acclaimed Iran Reframed, Professor Narges Bajoghli.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to all of the students and all of the teams for your really incredible reports and all the work that you all did throughout the year to get to this point, the trips that you took, the hours that you put in the classes, as well as in the lead up after the trips to sort of getting all of this information together. I think you guys showed what teamwork can look like, and you also met the challenges of COVID-19 hitting in the middle of the semester and not being able to meet face-to-face any longer to work on this. But I think you all should be very proud of the work that you've done, and this was really great. Some of the things that we learned, or that I learned specifically from the presentations for today, was really the importance, I think, highlighted in different ways throughout the three presentations about the importance of intergenerational engagement and the ways in which women, especially in the ways that they make community all throughout the world by taking care of children, and then also being caretakers with parents and living intergenerational lives. This is a primary way in which gender socialization happens throughout the world, and the fact that all three groups sort of highlighted that, I think, goes a long way in showing how issues around gender are really ones in which that we need to work together in this sense and work intergenerationally. And I think as far as methodologically, what the three groups presented to us today showed really the importance of context-specific recommendations and how incredibly important fieldwork is in allowing us to understand topics not just in the abstract, but to be able to see the world through other sets of eyes that are not our own, and therefore try to see solutions in ways that are not just dependent upon the frameworks that we're used to using. I think that all three groups really showed their ability to do work in that lens and to understand what it means to work collaboratively and how we can share best practices across all of our different locations. I think one of the things that you know, these projects kind of lead us to think more about are the ideas of collaboration and the fact that, you know, when you ask women, and this has been shown in research over research by scholars, is that when you ask women in whatever society you are looking at, they know the problems that they face. They understand them. They don't need someone to come in and tell them that these are our problems. They will know it better than anyone who has written you know, PhD dissertations on these different communities. But part of the problem is that how do you enact those changes? And I think these are the questions that you all were grappling with throughout this year and in working on these presentations and in working on these projects. And I think part of what you all showed is that when we can collaborate with each other, both as teams within, you know, who you all were with, but also collaborations with the university settings and the NGOs and all of the different local groups that you guys met, when you all could put your heads together and think, I think it creates these much richer forms of recommendations that you all came to. Now, one of the things that this present moment brings us, which both Professor Nwankwor and our keynote speaker sort of started our presentations with, is that COVID-19 is not just a health issue, but it's showing over and over again, the more that we're sort of getting reporting from all over the world, that it's a social issue, it's a mental health issue, it's a cultural issue, and above all, it is a gender issue. As the speakers for the Philippines project pointed out, disaster affects women above and beyond other sectors of society. And COVID-19 is showing that even in the preliminary information that we're getting right now. So domestic violence ends have skyrocketed across societies. The ramifications of what we're beginning to see unfold right now are going to be with us for a long time, and gender is going to be at the center of this. And so in that light, then it's not enough for us to just think about making recommendations to what these different societies around the world can do, but for us to understand that it requires changes deep within every single society. So in the Ethiopia project, for example, you all brought up the fact that political representation matters. So the more that women would see women in positions of leadership, the more that it meant that they could begin to even see that as a possibility for themselves. Representation matters, we know that, but we're now also in a situation in which in many societies, especially some of the more powerful ones in the world, the representation that we have as the heads of our states hold very masculinist and machoistic views. And those are the messages we're now getting at the highest levels of political office. And so as we think about how gender and women are going to be adversely affected pretty much on every indicator level that we have with COVID-19 and the longer that it goes on, we need to think very seriously about all of these issues. And that means that we need to also understand that all of these issues that you all talk so eloquently about in your presentations today also very much apply in every single one of our societies. And so that means we need to work, and for those of us who are American, we need to work to understand the situation in which 63% of white women voted for Trump, who was such a misogynistic, had that sort of language. How do we work on all of these issues in all of our respective societies? Because they're all related to one another. And if we have certain leaders in countries that are powerful, like the United States and others around the world, populated by such highly misogynistic leaders who also enact misogynistic policies, then no matter the amount of recommendations we give, these issues of gender just keep rolling further and further back. So this is something that, as powerful as all of your recommendations are, I think it also shows us that we need to work just as hard on every single one of these issues as at home, wherever our home may be, because these things are all linked to one another. And lastly, what I'll end with is, I think in this context in which we know that women are going to be at the forefront of so many of the repercussions of COVID-19, how do we organize and how do we think about these issues all together in an environment of social distancing? And especially knowing that across pretty much every single society, women are at the margins, in the sense that they're not the ones who hold the centers of power in socially distanced societies in which organizing and collective sort of gathering becomes hard. What that means is that those who hold power will just hold on to power harder, and that's going to be have dire consequences for women all over. And so I think that right now is actually a time when all of your brains and the ways that you guys have learned and sort of taken on these projects in this past year are going to really serve you and hopefully serve all of us in the ways that we think about going into the future. So thank you all so much for a really great year. And I really want us to also thank Professor Nwankwor for leading SAIS Women Lead and really taking it under her wings and making it become this really successful program that it has. So thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Narges. Well, obviously, this program wouldn't have been the success that it is without your very committed assistance. So thank you so very much. We appreciate it. We'll now take some questions. We'll take 3 questions in a row, and then we'll have the teams respond to the questions based on the expertise and topics. Again, like we said, please feel free to submit your questions using the Q&A button. We have quite a number of questions here, and we're hoping to quickly get through as many of those as we can. And so to start off, we have a question that's for any of the groups. Have you met many men who were actively engaged in reducing gender-based equality and various gender issues? If yes, how do we improve this group further? If not, are there social barriers you notice that may have prevented men in acting in this capacity? That's question 1. Question 2, for Ethiopian team, which of your recommendations do you think are most critical for real change? Which are most easily implemented? And then for the Nepal team, your campaign strategy was intriguing. What is the connection between a skill like agriculture or sewing and empowering women to relate their experience of gender-based violence? So we'll take these 3 and then we can move on. And the first question, whether you've met any men who were involved in reducing gender-based inequality, perhaps would have the Nepalese team answer that.
I can take a shot at it. Thanks everyone for coming today and for this question. So actually, when we were in country, there were several different male allies that were work staff or also just working through different programming in country that we noticed were really on board with all of the initiatives and programming that Warwick was advocating for. I think if we get at some of the barriers for why men aren't participating in such high levels, this kind of came to light when we were doing the workshop. Men and women were interacting, as I said in the presentation, but there was definitely clear expectations of certain gender roles in Nepali society. So I think that kind of shapes how men see their role to participate in these programs, and also puts certain expectations on men. We also had this encounter, like when we were in the eco village interacting with women, that men were uncomfortable sitting in on certain conversations about patriarchy and different norms that restrict women from advancing. So I think there's still a long way to go, but we did see kind of both sides of strong men or male allyship, but also men who weren't ready to approach the conversation.
Thank you. Ethiopian team. Ethiopia, do you want to take the question? Okay, maybe let's then move to Nepal. Which of your strategies, what is the connection between a skill and empowering women to relate the experience of gender-based violence?
Okay, I can take that. So while we're in country, we really realized that allowing women to develop skills really allowed them a voice. It allowed them a voice, it allowed them a way to express themselves in communities where they often felt like they didn't have a place. Also, it provides a lot of women with an income. Okay, it allows women to become financially independent from their husbands, which allows them a sort of strength and confidence to actually stand up and speak out against unequal treatment. And so those are the two things that we really noticed through survivors that we spoke to, through workshops, through a lot of different activities that we did in country, is really that providing women with skills allowed them a stronger voice and allowed them some financial independence.
Okay, thank you. Ethiopian team, go ahead.
Okay, so the question was, which of our recommendations do we think are critical for real change? And we really believe that all our recommendations are critical to change. As Sam mentioned earlier, we found barriers on 3 different levels, and we found that these barriers are intersectional and they often reinforce each other. So we constructed our recommendations in a way that they target each level, each barrier on each level. For example, the language campaign targets the language on the societal level, and streamlining the processes for accreditation for civic education targets education on the political barrier level. So we really think that attacking all the barriers on each level is important to bring about change. And the second part of the questions is, which one is the most easiest implemented? And as for me, I believe the language campaign is the easiest to implement, because we really want to normalize the idea that women belong in the public sphere and not just in the private sphere. And I think that's what the language campaign does by changing the masculine form of pronouns and nouns to the feminine form.
Okay, thank you. We have another question here for the Ethiopian team. Did you discuss less formal outlets of participation? For example, community groups, social networks, finance circles, etc. And did your interviewees see these as relevant? And while you hold on to that, let's take 2 more questions. For the Cebu team, can you elaborate on how disaster relief planning can be made more gendered in the Philippines? If government officials are largely male, how might this take place? So let's just go ahead and answer those 2 and then we'll go on. So Ethiopia.
Yeah, so I can start off, and then I know Sam also has a few comments about this. So I think what I want to make clear to everyone about our research is that we were actually looking not really at women at the political or elected level. We were looking at women's engagement at a more grassroots level. So we actually talked to several financial groups. We talked to someone who did their PhD and did a lot of work with informal groups in some of the more forest areas of Ethiopia, which was really interesting. And we also talked to a lot of NGOs that did a lot more informal conversations about women's political participation across Addis Ababa. So that's the first point. I think the second point about did people realize that this was political participation? I think that was probably the most interesting finding that we had, was that a lot of people didn't realize that they were being engaged in their community and that they were being very active and important citizens in their community. And unfortunately, we didn't have time to go through it, but we did go through it in very extensive detail in our report. It revolves around having a different image of what politics is. And a lot of people think of politics as being an elected member. And being in politics or being involved in your community are very important, and they're not necessarily this like high level thing that we often think about. Being involved in a community group is being a part of the political process, whether you necessarily see it or not. Sam, if you have anything else you want to add.
Yeah, I wanted to echo your point, Stephanie, because I think it was just such an important part of our report to have people list off like what they're involved in, and then they're saying, oh, but that's not politics. You know, there is this kind of sense that either you are voting or you're a politician. That's politics, but they're involved in their community and things like that. And so in actually one of our recommendations that we didn't get to, we were trying to find a way to broaden this understanding. And we were gonna maybe start with a civic engagement campaign at coffee ceremonies or in local, meeting places and things like that, just to kind of break down this huge divide between community participation and politics. Because for a long time, politics was seen as, a very negative thing, and it still is. So I think I just wanted to echo Steph's point, but you teed it up so nicely.
Okay, thank you. Cebu, can you elaborate on how disaster relief planning can be made more gendered in the Philippines?
Yeah. So the first thing is that we noticed that a lot of the local communities actually don't have a disaster risk reduction plan. And so the first thing is to ensure that these local communities do have some sort of plan, may that be an evacuation plan or any sort of plan to evacuate once a disaster happens. And that is where we think that the university and CSOs can work with homeowners associations to develop these plans. And then specifically, we also saw that a lot of NGOs are actually working on the ground with the homeowners associations to improve the likelihood of their survival likelihood during a disaster. And we saw that they have these trainings, and these trainings are actually very well received from the local communities. And we think that these trainings can have more of a gender lens in them. And so when they're creating a disaster plan, for example, they can ensure that the community is, first of all, aware that women suffer more than men, and that women have more burdens, such as their children or other sanitary and hygienic needs. And so once this awareness is raised, we think that this will increase the likelihood that they will develop a disaster plan that will incorporate the needs. So for example, if you have an evacuation plan, perhaps they can have an evacuation plan that ensures that women that are pregnant are evacuated earlier on than everyone else, or women with all their children are evacuated before everyone else is. We also saw that in the post-disaster, many women faced challenges with their homes being completely destroyed and didn't have any sort of support either by the local communities or by the government. And perhaps these women didn't have husbands anymore. And so they were left completely on their own. And so these things are things that need to be made aware of. And if addressed, will increase the likelihood that women can survive these disasters.
Okay, thank you. And so we'll take a couple more questions. This question is for all the teams. Based on your research and findings, what qualities did you find most important in driving good leadership and why? One more, this is for the Ethiopian team. Excellent work by all the groups, congratulations. A question for the Ethiopian team. I am surprised that the use of electoral gender quotas was not among your recommendations for women at the state or local level. Quotas would bring more women into office, thereby providing the much needed role models. As you mentioned, there is an important symbolic representation effect of more women in office. I applaud you for suggesting that political parties need to have more women in leadership and play a pivotal role. This is important as well. So I guess this is more of a suggestion, a gap that your presentation did not address, but perhaps you addressed in your reports. So do you want to answer the question? What do you find to be the most important quality driving good leadership? Zarina Bentham.
Okay, so I can answer that question and then go into the Ethiopia question as well, or should I? Okay.
Yes.
So for us, that was actually one of the questions that we asked our participants directly. What do you think makes a good leader? And I think that there was general consensus on confidence. And when you look at sort of the conversations that we had with many of the women, it's a confidence that comes from awareness. So when we talk about education, not just the formal education, but even education surrounding the processes and the different aspects of governance and things like that. So I think I would say that one of the big things was confidence, especially for women. To answer the question about, not touching on electoral quotas in our recommendations, this came up in our conversations with some key informants that we spoke to. So these are CSOs, civil society organizations, and other professional organizations. So a lot of these organizations did actually lobby for there to be quotas in political parties for women. However, it did not pass at the parliamentary level. So there was a bill introduced and the bill did not pass. So that's why that is not one of our recommendations, because it had been attempted previously and it failed. So there are, however, incentives for women to be active in political parties. So that's the basic answer to that. And I think Stephanie had something to add as well. If not, we can.
Yeah. Yeah, I think Zarina, again, I think covered a lot of it. And like I mentioned earlier, I think one of the big things that we were really looking at in our report was, again, how do we involve more of your average day citizen in being involved in politics. And I think that's why our main recommendation also wasn't necessarily targeted at electoral quotas, either at the state or the local level, is because we want to find a more direct way that we can get women involved in politics that isn't necessarily elected office. I think with kind of advocating for parties to kind of reorganize their internal structure, because that law didn't pass, it would mean that parties would need to adopt voluntary quotas in order to be able to get more women's political participation that would then have an aspirational effect at the state or local level. So that's one point. I think the other point that I think is really important to this is about advocating for making it easier for CSOs. Is we need more direct involvement in that, and CSOs need to be the ones that are directly having those connections with women. And so if we can make that process easier, we think that's more of a direct way that we will get what we want to accomplish and what we talked about in our report.
Okay, thank you. We have several more questions. If women do not have the time, given their primary care giving roles in their families, what are the chances of women getting involved in politics? And to what degree, even with skills acquisitions and a degree of financial independence? What was the biggest challenge in your research? What would you change in your methodology? And one more. For Miranda, so you have a question that's asking, what would be the topic of the podcast that, not Miranda, the Nepalese team, what would be the topic of the podcast that you recommend for your client to adopt? So maybe we start from the last one and then go up.
Yeah, I can answer that. So for the podcasts are just starting to hit Nepal, and because local radio is so popular, that's why we recommended it. And we actually met with an organization that focuses on media dissemination in Nepal, and they're actually working on spreading podcasts throughout Nepal. And so he was really excited about us meeting with him and hopefully partnering with Warwick in the future to create a podcast. But originally, some of our ideas were dramas are really popular on local radio. So it's almost like watching like a telenovela on TV, but you're listening to it. And so we figured that Warwick can create these dramas, basically like an episode on a podcast, but then showing good behavior, gender norm behaviors, and like properly respecting women and things like that, that will slowly over time help change norms and the values that people have. Because just an informational, this is what gender-based violence is, while informative, is not necessarily the most entertaining. So we don't think it would be as popular in Nepal, and so, or in general. And so we think that by having these dramas, it'll encapsulate a large population, but also be informative and change behaviors.
Great. The second question. The Ethiopian team. So if women do not have time, how then do you expect them to go on and participate more in politics?
Yeah, I can answer that. I mean, this is obviously going to be a continuing challenge for a while. And that's why we kind of tried to recommend this holistic approach. It's not like if we increase women voters, then suddenly societal barriers will go away, for instance. But we're hoping that maybe we can explore previously understudied networks, like the fact that maybe women can form these unofficial coalitions where maybe neighbors take care of their children while they go vote or participate in meetings and those types of more community-based things. So, but yeah, exactly to the point. It's not like this one thing is going to solve all of these issues immediately, but we hopefully emphasize in the report that there's this holistic approach and that it could be community-based.
Great, and obviously, like you said, it's more of a domino effect, right? Because if there's a change in norms and values, then the tendency for men to accept more roles and responsibilities at home becomes higher, which then frees women, right? Gives women more time. And then if there's an increase, if the education gap is reduced and women have jobs, that are less precarious, right, are more stable, then also frees them. So it's more of a domino effect, right? And hopefully we hope to get there in not only Ethiopia, but also across most of the other countries in Africa. Great, so let's take a couple more questions. Going forward, the question is, you're making recommendations. Will you be there, the Nepalese team, will you be there to continue to help Warwick to implement these recommendations you have made? For example, they said, will you be there to help Warwick develop the website that has just begun?
So we actually gave our presentation on some of our initial recommendations to Warwick back in January, right before we finished our field research in Nepal. And so they've had the basics of our recommendations so they can start working on it. And we've been in communication with them since January, and they've begun reworking the website around the themes that we've suggested. And while we won't be officially working on the project anymore after class is over, we still have communication channels with Shirsti and Lakshmi, who are in charge over at Warwick, and are happy to tell them how things are going. But the website's already been improved immensely and it looks really good. We encourage you all to check out Warwick on social media, and you'll get to see our nice products that we spent all semester making, and they're Warwick, WOREC at Nepal on Instagram or online.
And just to quickly piggyback off of what Emily just said, we're also supplying them with a media packet, which has infographics that we designed, and we'll come up with the media dissemination plan. So our suggestions for how we think that these material will be better served, as well as a beautiful video that Emily Inge helped make. And so we're providing them with a packet of materials to use, as well as our suggestions for how they can utilize them.
Okay, great. A question for Zarina. She made an interesting point about language being a barrier to political participation, with particular reference to political jargon. Can she share an example of such political jargon? And what is the fundamental reason why political jargon is a barrier?
Yes, definitely. I think to use maybe a more recent or current example, currently Ethiopia is going through a phase where, because of the coronavirus pandemic, they're having to push back their elections. And that makes the sitting president and government unconstitutional, because they should have been out of power this year, but that's not going to happen. So in a lot of the media, people are calling it a constitutional crisis. Now, if you're not familiar with what is in the Constitution, or how the Constitution affects elections, or how long a presidential mandate is, it's hard to wrap your mind around what a constitutional crisis is. And it's a barrier because if you don't fully understand and can't fully appreciate exactly what is being communicated across, then how do you adequately participate in it? So that's one example that I can think of, and how it poses itself as a barrier.
Great. Are we going to receive the presentations and the report of this webinar? Yes and yes. The teams' reports will be published online on the SAIS Women Lead website, and then going forward, you will most likely also see it in one of the peer-reviewed journals. And you can get in touch with us, and we can send you a recorded link of this event. Okay, let's take a couple more questions. How do your recommendations to modify traditional norms? So how do you recommend that traditional norms be modified in Ethiopia, and what kind of lasting effect will that have on women? I think this is for Ethiopia.
Professor Nwankwor, can you repeat the question one more time?
Right, so how do you recommend, because you said that one of your recommendations or your findings is that norms and traditional values, right, constrain women's political participation. The question is, how do you recommend a change in norms and traditional values, right? And the follow-up is, and how do you expect that this will change women's lives? But I think, what you want to really answer is, how do you go about changing these traditional norms and values?
Mm-hmm. I think what we need to appreciate is the fact that it takes a really long time for something to become a norm. It takes a really long time for something to become tradition. So in the same way, it's going to take a good amount of time to rebuild a new normal, or to rebuild new norms, or to remake something a tradition. But I think, for example, the language recommendation gets to the heart of it, because we saw in research how language created the norm of women being perceived in a certain way. And we are recommending that use that same tool of language, but now cause it to empower women in your messaging. So I think these little changes done over a long period of time will allow us to see how it will change women, the lives of women in Ethiopia. So the question is the answer is to normalize anything. It has to be done over a long period of time. And this is the importance of CSOs that advocate for women and other organizations like that, and these campaigns that promotes just normalizing things that pertain to women. So it will take some time, but it can be done.
Okay, let's just quickly we have a number of other questions. Let's quickly run through this. So maybe Mabel, you want to take this. What was the biggest challenge in your research? What would you change in your methodology?
I think our biggest challenge was definitely financial and time constraints. We didn't have enough time to explore a lot of regions in Ethiopia. We were only able to go to 2 regions, and I feel like if we had more time and more financial resources, we'll be able to go to other regions and explore the barriers that's specific to those areas as well. What will change in our methodology? I think we would have included more voices of men to see how this, like for example, our recommendation to like improve, promote women in political parties. It will be interesting to see how men react to that, how seeing more women in politics change their own norms and their own beliefs about women. So just including more male voices to see how their own norms and attitude about women will change.
Great, and the other 2 things, really quickly, what were the challenges, major challenges you had in your field work?
Okay, I think for Nepal team, I would say maybe the cultural differences, because Nepal is like a typical Asian country, and for our team, like I think there are a lot of differences. And one interesting I want to talk about is, when Nepali people, they shake their head, it actually means yes. So for us, it's actually, we're always like surprised by their gestures and their like daily life differences. And also I think the language differences is also another big challenge, because for our research, we do need to interact with local people. And so I would say if there's something we can change, we would definitely have like more communications with some Nepali students at SAIS and try to know more about like local culture and like local norms before we head out to Nepal. Yeah.
Okay, Philippines?
I think really I'd echo what the others have said in terms of biggest challenges. I think it was really a combination for us of time constraints and also kind of cultural and language barriers. We too had to use translators, and we had really amazing translators and research assistants working with us, but obviously there is always that kind of slight barrier and dimension where you're missing every kind of specific nuance that the participants were saying. Also, because of the specific time we were able to go to Cebu to conduct research, we happened to overlap with the biggest festival that Cebu has all year while we were there. And so a lot of communities were actually gearing up to celebrate that festival. So they had somewhat limited time at times to discuss with us. And so that was another barrier, but also great to see Cebu while it was at its proudest.
Okay, so we are all out of time. We have one question here. Dr. Nwankwor, do you plan to have these scholars record lessons learned? Yes, yes, and yes. They are doing that already. And so thank you all so very much for your audience, and thank you for your engagements. We have several questions here that unfortunately we cannot get to. but we want to invite you to reach out to us on Instagram, on Twitter. You can email us. And we are really looking forward to your continued partnership and alliance as we all go ahead and contribute all we can to making sure that we change the world, or we leave this world a better place for generations to come. Thank you again to all our allies. Thank you to our partners. Thank you to all the collaborators, and to you students. You have done excellently well. We are very proud of you here at SAIS, and we know that you go ahead to do great things. So thank you till we meet again next year for the presentation. Bye-bye, stay safe and be well.
Thank you, Professor. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for joining.
Thank you.